All right, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you are, and welcome to this webinar of the Geographical Sciences Committee of the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Our speakers today are David Padgett, who will be discussing the democratization of geospatial technology for underserved communities, as well as Jennifer Devine, who will examine ethical considerations raised by conducting research on deforestation in Central America's protected areas, which is causing drug trafficking. This is the third webinar in a series organized by the GSC Committee on Ethics and Biases in the Geographical Sciences. I'll be saying more about our speakers in a minute, but my name is Benjamin Preston, and I'm a member of the Geographical Sciences Committee, and I will be the moderator for this particular webinar. So before we turn to our speakers, I want to provide a few details. So both David and Jennifer are going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to turn to a QA session for the remainder of the time. So we're going to be taking questions through the QA box that's located at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. So you can simply type your questions into that box at any time during this particular webinar. And then when we come to the QA session, I will be taking a look at questions that have been posed and facilitate presenting those to our presenters for a response. Another reminder, this webinar is being recorded. So any questions that you submit may be read out loud and included in our recording. And a link to the recording, as well as a copy of the slides, will be made available on our website within about a week of this particular webinar. So if you have any technical issues during this event, please contact Zoom support. The number is 1-888-799-9666. That's extension 2. And before I turn over to speakers, I would like to say a few words about the Geographical Sciences Committee in terms of providing a little background and context. So the committee is a standing committee of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. The National Academies are nonprofit organizations with a dual mission to both honor the nation's top scientists and to provide objective, independent advice on science, technology, engineering, and medicine. The academies were established at the direction of President Lincoln, and therefore been providing these kinds of services for over 150 years. So that's an interesting factoid, which I just learned about recently. So our committee, the Geographical Sciences Committee, provides advice to society and government at all levels, particularly regarding methods for spatial analysis and representation. We address the geographic dimensions of human-environment interactions, spatial location and concentration, and place-based research and policy at all spatial scales. The committee also fosters international cooperation by serving as a liaison to other national geographical organizations, including as we're the official US liaison to the International Geographical Union. And this committee is supported with funding from the National Science Foundation. So the current composition of the committee is presented here. And again, I'm Ben Preston, and I'm affiliated with the RAND Corporation. And some of the issues that we've been tackling as a committee over the past 3 years, including issues around needs and research requirements for land use and land use change modeling, contributions to long-term approaches for wildfire management, equity and access and health effects of exposure to nature, including costs and benefits, opportunities and consequences of using sensors to capture human geographical behaviors, and the vulnerability of US energy infrastructure to coastal flooding. So that gives you a flavor of the kinds of activities we're involved in. So to introduce you to today's speakers. So first, Dr. David Padgett is an associate professor of geography and director of the Geographic Information Sciences Laboratory at Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee. Since joining the TSU faculty in 1999, he has developed a geography environmental justice curriculum with a strong emphasis upon service learning. For 2 decades, he has conducted faculty GIS workshops at many historically Black college and university institutions. In April of last year, Padgett was awarded the American Association of Geographers Presidential Achievement Award for significant contributions in advancing geography, GIS, and STEM education within the historically Black college and university system. And in September of last year, he was named an Ethical Geo Fellow by the American Geographical Society in support of its project called Democratizing Geospatial Technology, a model for providing technical assistance and community-based participatory mapping to environmental justice stakeholder communities. Earlier this year, Padgett was named the 2020 Youth Learning as Citizen Environmental Scientists Incorporated Youth Environmental Science Medalist, accompanied by a $10,000 grant to organizations that involve youth in environmental science. So we're quite fortunate to have David here with us today. And then in addition, Dr. Jennifer Devine is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at Texas State University. She is a critical human geographer and political ecologist who studies the environmental impacts of drug trafficking, US Central American politics, grassroots and environmental justice movements, tourism, and cultural heritage management. She teaches courses on political geography and environmental politics and transnational migrations. She's recently published articles examining drug trafficking's impacts on land use biodiversity and protected area governance, as well as community-based resource management and the politics of tourism development. These publications have appeared in journals such as Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Global Environmental Change, the Journal of Peasant Studies, Land Use Policy, Antipodes, and the Journal of Latin American Geography. Popular press outlets worldwide, such as NPR and BBC Science Focus, have reported on her research team's findings. And then lastly, again, as a reminder, if you're having technical difficulties, here's the information on the screen right now, assuming you can actually see that, that you can use to contact to address any difficulties you're having to make sure you can continue to participate in the webinar. There's also a link that you can use to subscribe for future information on committee events. So with that as way of introduction, I'm going to turn things over to David so he can provide his presentation. And I will join you later for Q&A.
Good afternoon. Just want to make sure everybody can see my presentation okay. Yes?
Yes, looks good, David.
Okay. So I'm going to be sharing over the next few minutes some of the work that I've been doing in terms of democratizing geospatial technology, which is a project that is supported by an American Geographical Society program called Ethical Geo that's funded by the Ahmed Yar Foundation. And so obviously when we map human populations, there are ethical considerations that must be taken into account. My work is specifically with environmental justice stakeholder communities. And from an ethics standpoint, many of these communities have been involved in geographic information systems mapping as subjects, not necessarily as agents. And so my over 20 years of work in these communities, I've seen communities see themselves mapped without having any control over how those maps appear or how they're used. And so I'm just going to share with you how I go about assisting these communities and empowering themselves to make change using geographic information systems. And the ethics in this is that it's a level playing field for the actors and the GIS developers. Okay, here we go. So again, Ethical Geo, democratizing geospatial technology. Started this project last summer, working in several communities throughout the country. And we're hoping at the end of this to have a replicable model for participatory mapping for environmental justice stakeholders, or anybody who is engaged in some form of change effort at the community level. Why democratizing geospatial technology? Why is a methodology needed? Well, those of us who use this technology know that the learning curve is somewhat steep. And that's often used as a way of putting up a wall between GIS developers, users, applications experts, and so on, and community-based and grassroots organizations, i.e., this technology is too much for you to use yourself. Allow me to show you how to use the technology, which means that I, as the GIS expert, oftentimes will hold all the data on my computer or on my server and not necessarily share the data with the community. But hopefully at the end of this, we will have a methodology that can be replicable that'll change that. Here's our framework. And this framework involves myself as the GIS expert. I'm assisted by Miss Olivia Harbison, who is one of my graduate assistants here at Tennessee State University, who has extensive knowledge and experience in GIS. What we found in working with the various community-based organizations listed here in the Gulf states of the United States, Houston, Florida, et cetera, what we found in many cases is that activist organizations are heavily populated by aging baby boomers. You know, the baby boomers are in their 60s and 70s. They're in great health. They want to give back to their communities. They join these various organizations. And any of us who've ever been involved at the community level, when we work with these organizations, find that they're very age heavy in the baby boomer and older age groups, which is great. Lots of experience, oftentimes lots of access to resources, lots of connections, but not very computer savvy, somewhat, sketchy skills in terms of GIS, especially. So what we found is that the children and grandchildren of these activists are very tech savvy. But what's interesting is often we find at these community-based organization and grassroots meetings, the children are sitting in the corner asking when is the meeting going to be over, or maybe they're not even there at all. But because these young people are so tech savvy, we are engaging them with their elders to work collectively to utilize this technology to empower them and bring about change. This, intergenerational activity. We've been very fortunate. The Environmental Systems Research Institute has provided free organizational licenses for our stakeholders for 1 year. The Tennessee State University GIS Lab is providing handheld GPS receivers, and the community-based organizations are selecting young people to work with us as youth mappers. Step one is actually going on the ground in the communities. In many cases, a lot of food desert maps, a lot of environmental justice maps are created by GIS users from a 30,000 foot level. They never do any ground truthing. They never actually go to these communities. Communities see themselves on a map. Oh, did you know that your community is a food desert? Oh, I didn't know that. We go to these communities, we actively engage with these stakeholders, and we think that that's the ethical thing to do. the community in asset mapping, the community defines their assets. You know, we can find good in all of our communities. Oftentimes, when underserved communities are mapped, we are looking at deficits. Where are all the abandoned buildings? Or where's all the crime? Where are all the toxic release sites? So on and so forth. But what if we look for assets? What if we find the good things in these communities so that we can replicate them? Do we need more playgrounds? Let's find a way to make more playgrounds. The one playground we have is great. Let's have more of them. Do we need a community garden? Certainly. The community garden that we have is great. Why not have 3 or 4 or 5 community gardens instead of just one? Are there land uses that outsiders might see as negative that others might see as positive? And so we begin with walking communities without any technology, no GPS receivers, no apps, just walking the community. A lot of us in the world that we live in today, our car-driven environment, we don't walk our communities. When we do, we find lots of things that we might not have seen before that can be identified as assets that can be improved upon. And so here is a typical walkthrough with the near Buzzard Point neighborhood group in Washington, D.C. We walk neighborhoods. A lot of people from the outside might see this vacant lot as an eyesore. It's not very well kept up. It's a blight upon the community. When we do asset mapping in underserved communities, we look at the possibilities. What could this vacant lot be? Could it be an urban garden? Could it be a playground? If we don't look at the land and open space in our communities for the potential good, then we can never move it to the next level. What about this? Underutilized property. Perhaps if we put the right resources in place, this could be a place of employment, a place of employment for young people, a place of employment for people returning our communities after serving their time for criminal activity to try to turn their lives around. But if we just look at this as blight, then it will remain that way. So here's the first case study. Many of you are familiar with the Lower Ninth Ward community, I guess, got a lot of attention after Hurricane Katrina. Flooding continues to be a problem in the Lower Ninth Ward. So I'm working with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and community stakeholders in the Lower Ninth Ward. And last year, youth mappers went out and identified flood-prone areas in the Lower Ninth Ward using our community asset methodology and actually produced maps that showed where catchment basins were most likely to flood and developed a strategy so that those catchment basins could be cleared, with the more severely damaged ones being put under the attention of New Orleans government, and those that could be cleaned out through community efforts. And so these were young people, high school students that took this on, learned the technology very quickly, and were able to produce maps that are affecting change in terms of flooding in New Orleans. Case study number 2, Wedgewood Community in Pensacola, Florida is plagued. This is an African-American community that is plagued by at least 12 to 13 landfills that are literally in their backyards. I mean, you can literally step out of one of these individuals' backyard into a massive landfill. We went to the Wedgewood community. We did a GIS and mapping training. The community stakeholders themselves went to produce maps, created maps, went to a county commission meeting, and they successfully blocked plans to construct a 4-lane highway through their neighborhood. People were going to lose their homes. People were going to have to be subjected to highway traffic. The stakeholders used these maps, and once they presented them to the county commission, that 4-lane highway was stopped, and the funds, the millions of dollars of funding that was going to be used for that highway has been diverted to assist the environmental needs of the people in the Wedgewood community. Another case of communities using this very high-tech technology for empowerment, not being features on a map, but creating maps. Case study number 3, Turkey Creek community in Gulfport, Mississippi, a very historically significant Black community. But however, their community is being threatened by a major development called the North Port property, which is essentially an inland port facility and storage facility that is being planned as a secondary inland port in the event that the coastal port is damaged by a hurricane or some other event. So the community is using GIS to show that they exist. Outdated zoning maps have this community zoned as industrial, as if no people live there, as if that community is not there. This is what the developers are presenting to certification boards, to permit boards, saying that this community doesn't exist. These communities are doing asset mapping to show that we absolutely exist. As a matter of fact, there's a lawsuit that these maps are being used as evidence in that's ongoing right now. So they're actually using this geospatial technology in evidentiary hearings in court as they fight to prevent their communities from being overrun by this facility. As a note, the zoning codes that were created here in Mississippi in this particular community were created during a time when African Americans could not vote in that state for a variety of reasons. So that's how you get a residential community zoned industrial. Case study number 4, fascinating case here. Last year in Africatown, the Clotilda, which was the last known ship to have illegally transported Africans from Africa to the US, in 1860, the ship was found. The wreckage of the ship was found. And because of the notoriety of of the ship, major attention has been brought to the Africatown community. People have descended upon this place because it is so historically significant. There are living descendants of the 110 Africans who were kidnapped and brought to Mobile, Alabama on that ship in 1860. Those descendants and others are organizing. They're using GIS to retain control of their history, culture, and assets. What they do not want to have happen is for others to come in to Africatown, co-opt their history, and the descendants, it would be a shame if the descendants of the people on the Clotilda had to pay to go on a tour of their own town. And so those maps are being used to encourage the development of heritage tourism, the monies raised from which will go back to the people in the Africatown community. And speaking of ethics, out of respect to my stakeholders, I'm not going to show you this map. The map is theirs. They don't want anybody to see it right now for fear of it being co-opted. There are some precious historical resources in Africatown that they don't necessarily want the outside world to see yet. So out of respect to them, I'm not going to show you this map. And we know that that's not the case many, many times. Now this map I will show you, this is case study 5 in the Pleasantville community in Houston, Texas. It's a community that's in one of the large, adjacent to the large port areas in Houston. They are subjected to a lot of negative air quality impacts. Now, they themselves were able to get funding from the Environmental Defense Fund to locate air quality monitors throughout their community. And so we, in the map on the right, have used the EJ Environmental Justice Screening Tool, the Environmental Protection Agency Environmental Justice Screening Tool, and showed in this case the particulate matter 2.5 exposure risk in that community relative to where these monitors are located. So perhaps if there are funds for more monitors, they might perhaps site them over in the Galena Park community. As you can see on the center of the map, that red area is showing up as at high risk for particulate matter 2.5 exposure. And so again, this community is using this technology for its own protection. And further, now that we know that there is a correlation between COVID-19 hotspots and particulate matter 2.5 pollution emitters, that further is an incentive for this community to understand how PM 2.5 is affecting their respiratory health now that we're in the COVID-19 era. So this is literally a life or death issue, given the fact that African Americans are clearly the most susceptible to COVID-19 in terms of deaths and in terms of cases. Case study number 6, I worked with an organization called Girl Trek. Girl Trek is a national organization that gets primarily African American women out walking their communities for health and for historical education. And so they organized a walk supported by the Catalyst Miami organization. And so in the fall of 2019, we did an asset mapping exercise in historical Overtown. Overtown is a very historically significant Black community in South Florida. And they have numerous assets, which they wanted to have displayed. Now, in this case, the Overtown community absolutely wants the world to see their assets. And so with their help, we created the Historic Overtown Story Map Tour, which hopefully will bolster heritage tourism. Hopefully people will come to Overtown and develop property and develop businesses that will enhance the community and not take away from it through gentrification. Overtown community, many places in South Florida that are historically Black or brown are being severely impacted through gentrification. And so by highlighting the historical significance of their community, investments can be made to restore and enhance existing properties so that they can become part of a heritage tourism site that will then bring money and resources to the community and not take them out. So for additional information here, and also acknowledgements, want to acknowledge, of course, Ethical Geo, the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, Catalyst Miami, the Near Buzzard Point Resilient Action Committee in Washington, D.C. The link up to the Historic Overtown Community Story Map is there, along with the Wedgewood Community Hydrological Assessment Map. And of course, if you want to contact me, I'm available at Twitter at the link there. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks, David. I think we're going to turn straight away to Jennifer. So Jennifer, you want to share your screen and present your slides, and then we'll circle back at the Q&A period.
Okay, let me just get ready here. Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity to participate in this important webinar series looking at ethics and bias in geographical research. The title of my talk is Ethical Research, Narco-Deforestation in Central America's Protected Areas. I'm going to use this case study to discuss concerns regarding ethics and bias encountered by my colleagues and I when using geographical tools and methods to study illicit activities, conservation, and global change. Our team collectively has been studying various dimensions of what we call illicit global environmental change, focusing on drug trafficking, cocaine trafficking in particular in Central America. Some of these environmental impacts of drug trafficking include land use, land cover change, impacts on biodiversity, drug trafficking's implications for protected area governance, and perhaps most importantly, the impacts of drug trafficking on forest lives and livelihoods in Central America's remaining forests and protected areas. I'm going to narrow in on the Maya Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala today, an area that I know well, and focus on narco-driven deforestation, what we call narco deforestation. I started working in the Maya Biosphere Reserve over 10 years ago, conducting long-term ethnography with forest communities in the reserve who had organized through a long political process to create what is known today as the world's largest communally managed forest. This community forestry model is a land rights movement. It's a grassroots environmental and social justice movement and has become a model celebrated worldwide and an inspiration to other communities, indigenous and non-indigenous, who seek to manage their own resources and lands to pursue their lives and livelihoods as they determine them. Now, despite the success of community forestry, this movement is indeed threatened, and it's threatened by drug trafficking organizations that are deforesting areas of the reserve, which we can see here in this map. The deforestation in the Maya Biosphere Reserve, which was created in 1990, has been concentrated in the western half of the reserve, namely in two large national parks, Laguna del Tigre National Park, where you see a concentration of land use, land cover change, and forest fires, and the park in the west, the farthest west national park, Sierra de la Candon. So despite the fact that these are protected areas, national parks that should have the strictest, regulations on land use and land cover change, paradoxically, we see the most environmental degradation in the western half of the reserve. Now, in the eastern half of the reserve, where the community foresters and community concessions are located, we see that forest cover remains. So this is a bit of a conservation paradox, but our team argues that the vast majority of deforestation you see concentrated in the reserve's west is driven by narco deforestation. And namely, this deforestation is a result of drug trafficking organizations illegally cattle ranching in the Maya Biosphere Reserve, in the national parks where the communities are prohibited from sustainably managing land and resources. So if you're not familiar with this work, you might be asking yourself, what is narco cattle ranching, and why would drug cartels be cattle ranching illegally in Central America's remaining forests and protected areas? Well, it's important to understand that these activities in Guatemala, in particular the Maya Biosphere, really took off following interdiction efforts in Mexico in the early 2000s, when the Mexican government began to implement more militarized war on drugs policies. Drug traffickers relocated their smuggling routes just south of the border. And this interdiction pushed them into the Maya Biosphere Reserve, which shares 50% of Guatemala's border with Mexico. And drug traffickers began landing planes stuffed with cocaine in mass in this remote area, in these protected areas where the state manages these areas, and communities, if they're there, are there often illegally squatting in protected areas and are no position to denounce these activities. Over 100 airstrips have been found, clandestine airstrips have been found in the Biosphere Reserve. Cattle ranching, narco-capitalized cattle ranching, is also a very efficient mechanism for laundering narco capital. Cattle ranching compared to real estate or other agro industries that require more investment, cattle can be easily moved. So as drug cartels are responding to interdiction and seizure by authorities, it's very easy for them to move their capital in the form of cattle elsewhere. So this is why we argue that cattle ranching is the agro industry of choice in protected areas where this activity is illegal. So following that brief introduction to narco cattle ranching and sort of why it happens, I want to dig into the ethics and biases that exist researching this phenomenon of narco deforestation. And a question that my colleagues and I pose often to ourselves is, how can we, as researchers, ethically study phenomenon that is hidden, dangerous, and sensationalized? I think all of us are well aware of how narco trafficking, drug cartels have become very much part of popular culture, as evidenced by the plethora of programs dedicated to narcos and to sensationalizing drug trafficking organizations. I'm going to talk about 4 biases that I want to address here with you. The first is safety. The second is biases inherent in quantifying narco deforestation, which is something we attempt to do. And this leads me to talk about what I call the ethics of relational thinking. And then I'll close talking a little bit about geospatial technologies and the ways in which geospatial technologies and methods are being marshaled in the struggle and control for territory in the Maya Biosphere Reserve. So first, safety. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about safety. I think that what I have to say probably won't surprise you very much. It's a dangerous topic to study, but nonetheless, its impacts on lives and livelihoods and ecosystems is so profound that it's often worth the risk for us researchers. But our primary concern, of course, is the safety of our research participants. There have been several community forest concessionaires who have been assassinated by drug trafficking organizations for defending their territories, which they are required to do by law to denounce illegal activities taking place in their concessions. And indeed, these folks are already on the front line and facing immense danger. But we find a role that we can play in terms of making connections between illicit cattle ranching and the drug trafficking organizations that are funding those activities. And many of those direct connections simply can't be made by our collaborators on the ground. And so that's an important role I think we play. I'm happy to discuss more safety issues in the Q&A, but I want to address something that I think might be more provocative or nuanced for those of you who are attending this webinar. And it's this sort of impulse to quantify and the problems with quantifying this phenomenon. And this image is from a paper in land use policy my colleagues and I published recently, where we were using remote sensed imagery to determine what percentage of deforested lands in our samples, in 3 areas we sampled hit hard by land use change, what percentage had illegal cattle ranching activity on them. And we found that in the 3 areas we looked at, the multiple use zone road, Laguna del Tigre and Sierra de Lacandon, that the presence of illegal cattle ranching on deforested lands ranged from 49 to 87%. However, what percentage of illegal cattle ranching is linked with drug trafficking organization is a question that's nearly impossible to answer. First of all, it's not safe. And the question itself sort of necessitates this binary way of thinking about drug trafficking and drug trafficking activities. Either you are a narco or you're not. Either you choose to work for drug trafficking organizations or you don't. And not only is this sort of oppositional framing and division between narco and non-narco nearly impossible, if not impossible to do. We can't go out and survey and question the cattle ranches and the ranchers operating in the park safely. But I think that, you know, it's important to realize that the urge to distinguish between who is a narco and who isn't a narco is very much rooted in positivism and Western epistemologies that are grounded in binary thinking. And the urge exists because that's how policymakers and scientists think about what constitutes as knowledge. There's a desire on the communities to have that hard statistic, a desire on the part of media to be able to say clearly and crisply, this is a situation, but we can't make those quantifications and hard cuts without perhaps committing some epistemic violence. And one of the dangers of quantification is not only can we not do it well, but it lends itself when we're not careful, and often we don't have control of how the message is picking up and taken and publicized and circulated, is that, you know, this division but not binary between narco and not narco lends itself to criminalization of people and places. There are other individuals living in these areas that are there living quote unquote illegally, squatting on lands, not because they're choosing to live in narco territories or work for $5 a day as field hands on narco ranches, but because systems of inequality, landlessness, poverty, and violence have pushed people into national parks who have no other place to go. But these narratives of quantifying narco, talking about narcos, seeking out who is not, has resulted in criminalization and unfortunately eviction of peasants living in the Maya biosphere. So rather than thinking about this question of, well, what percentage of illegal cattle ranches is linked to narco capital? And this impulse to quantify, finally, by the end of that paper, we came around as a team to say, hey, actually, what's more important is not the division between what is narco and what is not narco, but the relations and connections between licit and illicit activities, movements. So then the question then becomes, when we think relationally, and we do so out of them as an ethical alternative to the dangers of quantification, that we start to ask questions about how do DTOs, drug trafficking organizations, shape socio-environmental systems? How do they articulate and transform other actors in this place, in the socio-environmental system, in the system of governance? What are the transformations and connections and practices of mutual transformation between the licit cattle industry and the illicit cattle industry? Focusing on relations and connections rather than binary oppositional approaches. And in doing so, we stop fetishizing the narco, and we can start to move our analysis, our relational analysis, and thinking about the systems and histories and policies that produce a park like Laguna de Tigre, where traffickers ranch often with impunity. We're able to move to a critique of broader systems, power relations, and histories. And for our team, this has meant a move away from a narco fetish, which I admit is something that we have perhaps been in danger of doing in our previous efforts to quantify narco culpability, to focus on a critique of US-led war on drugs. So the US-led war on drugs, I've already flagged, is pushing drug traffickers into protected areas. But this relational way of thinking also points to another dimension of US and European-led policy in the reserve that combines with the war on drugs to produce the disastrous and unintended outcomes that we call narco-deforestation. So currently I'm thinking about the ways in which the policies and practices of the drug war and its ideologies combine and articulate with the policies, practices, power relations of the global conservation movement that was responsible for creating those national parks of strict conservation that became territories ripe for narco land grabs, that indeed dispossessed people of access to those lands to create those national parks, which now have become what I call territories of impunity. So thinking about drug war conservation is useful because it helps us think more broadly about how the histories of conservation and policies of the war on drugs come together to produce the environmental impacts of drug trafficking that we see. But I also say that thinking about the relationship between the drug war and the Global Conservation Project helps us see how today conservation and tourism land grabs are being funded to reduce drug trafficking activity and increase security. And one said project that is unfolding as we speak and is on the Senate floor of the US Congress as we speak is Senate Bill 3131, the Maya Security and Conservation Partnership Program. This is a congressional bill for $60 million that will be matched by the Inter-American Development Bank should it be successful, that would create a wilderness preserve around the Mirador archaeology site in the Maya Biosphere Reserve. And you can see in the yellow boundaries on the map I've provided the existing boundaries of the Mirador Rio Azul National Park. This proposed Senate bill would amplify those boundaries. And it contradicts the legal boundaries and land rights of the community concessionaires that I have been working with for over 10 years. In the name of fighting drug trafficking. And actually some of our team's research looking at drug trafficking in this area has been used or appropriated by advocates for this Senate bill to campaign for the establishment of this wilderness area that is seen from the ground in the perspective of locals as a practice of land dispossession and an erasure of their communities from the landscape. So this project, while on the surface may seem like a win-win for all involved, it's actually being highly contested. And it illustrates how the Mirador Basin team proposing the amplification of this wilderness area, which would take away the ability of community foresters to manage and extract resources from that area, that they have used remote sensing technologies to make a scientific argument that the Mirador Basin, their claim to the geography of this space, that it exists. And so this is an example of how these geospatial technologies have been used in the production of territory in this place that is very complex. And indeed, the community foresters identify tourism and drug trafficking as the two main threats to their community environmental social justice movement. But it's not just the Mirador Basin project and the Senate Bill 3131 that uses geospatial technologies in problematic ways. Several colleagues of mine have been looking at how the recent LiDAR work in the Maya Biosphere Reserve has been picked up and circulated in mass, not just in academia, but in popular press, to create this narrative of discovery that enables tourism developers to lay claims to this space. And when I saw this narrative of discovery and lost villages on Trevor Noah's Comedy Central show, The Daily Show, I thought, oh boy, we're in trouble. right? This idea, this narrative of discovery, this colonial narrative of discovery that's being used, backed by science, to lay claims to these spaces, has profound impacts for the people living and working in these forests, who have known for decades where the archaeology sites are, and indeed were some of the first people to take the archaeologists there. So some of the broader ethical issues and biases in LiDAR research that some colleagues and I are starting a new project on to think through is to challenge, we want to challenge these narratives of discovery, pristine nature, the descriptions of ancient civilizations, because folks, point blank, they erase the communities that exist there, that have been taking care of that forest for hundreds of years, the legal battle for the community concessions, the contribution of local people to archaeological knowledge production, and also critiquing the way in which these narratives of discovery are backed up materially. That the $1 million investments that go into LiDAR projects to produce these discovery become down payment on acquiring private concessions for archaeological or ecotourism development. But I want to conclude here, and I think this wraps up really nicely with the first presentation, to say that geospatial technologies are not necessarily a weapon of the powerful, or are always going to reproduce colonial narratives and other types of inequalities that we want to address. What we see happening in the Maya biosphere among the community foresters themselves, and particularly the Association of Peten's Forest Communities, is that drones, remote sensing, GPS, these technologies are being used by the communities to produce knowledge that will be legible to many audiences, to help defend their land rights. And academics and organizers on the ground, as well as communities themselves, are organizing to stop Senate Bill 3131. And I've been really inspired to see the activism and collaboration among geographers, archaeologists, and community leaders in defense of their land rights. So thanks so much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to David as well. So we do have a little bit of time for questions, and we have a couple of questions that have come in. First, I do want to tackle just a logistical one. Yes, these presentations are going to be made available through the committee's website. So for those of you that enjoy them and want to see more of the detail, they will be available. So at the moment, we've got sort of questions for both David and Jennifer, as well as some that are specific to each of you. So I might tackle one of the first ones that came in specifically for David, which I think is a useful entry point, which is, specific. This comes from Andrew, specifically sort of these various case studies that you went through, which were really nice illustrations, I think, of sort of the uses and abuses of geographic information. What are the origins of those particular case studies? So are communities coming to you and sort of seeking, your guidance or input, or are you going out and sort of finding these places through, for example, one of these sort of top-down, mile-high looks? If you can elaborate on that, that'd be great.
Yes, the fascinating presentation just preceded me. Just wanted to say that first. I guess because I've been doing this for 30 years, and I have found this niche as a environmental justice, GIS, I don't want to use the word expert, but I guess if I'm not an expert after 30 years, I should be. Mostly word of mouth. I've just been out there so long that pretty much every week at least I'll get one or two requests for assistance. I'm aligned with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, which is headed by Dr. Robert Bullard and Dr. Beverly Wright. Well, Dr. Beverly Wright founded it. I want to say that. And they're the two leading voices in environmental justice literally on the planet. And so anybody that is involved with them is going to be introduced to me if geographic information systems applications are requested. But fortunately, there's a movement amongst African-American GIS experts, primarily millennials, who are coming to the fore, who are getting more engaged, because I really like being able to say to an organization called Black Girls Map, here's a community that needs assistance and so on and so forth. Perhaps one of you all could assist them instead of it pretty much being me. And so Black Girls Map is an organization that's doing some amazing, amazing things. African-American women doing GIS, something that just was not happening when I was that age. So yeah, people seek me out, and luckily I can pass the work along because now we have younger, very, very talented African-American GIS users who can go into these communities and affect change.
Great, thanks, David. So now one for Jennifer, and this is also from Andrew, might be the same Andrew. So after this, we'll try and mix it up a little bit. But specific questions around what remote sensing resources do you use for your efforts to map land use change? And how do the limits of remote sensing technologies affect your confidence in the information, confidence in the mapping, and our understanding of deforestation patterns and also causes and attribution?
Thank you for the question. Just to clarify that I'm trained as a political ecologist and critical human geographer, and I'm doing mixed method collaborative research with remote sensing experts, modelers, and statisticians. And it has been actually quite insightful as an outsider learning conceptually how these tools work. And my colleague Nate Currett and I, who have done quite a bit of this remote sensing work together, he's the remote sensing expert. He's using Landsat, of course, some higher resolution imagery that we have obtained anonymously from partners on the ground who talk about illegal cattle ranching but can't make that connection with drug trafficking for their own safety issues. But working as part of this team, what's been really shocking to me is how the uncertainty of the method and the limits of the method get built into the method and rendered invisible by the ways in which quantification, remote sensing, and more geographic scientific research gets taken as the big T truth versus the type of research I have done in the past as an ethnographer. So for me, it was an eye-opener about the limits of remote sensing technology to be able to get at this phenomenon, which in part inspired, my discussion about the biases involved in quantification.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. And there's a couple of questions, so I think either or both of you can comment on, which is really around sort of the teaching of geography. And so David Savage asks, how can we bring more ethical thinking around the teaching of spatial sciences, GIS, and geography into our courses? So I'm wondering if either of you can comment on that. And I'm going to pick up, a related question is around sort of how we develop curricula for teaching ethics in geography and geospatial applications. I think those are both closely related.
Well, I
So
guess
Jennifer, David, who wants to go first?
Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess in my case, I have to advocate for historically Black colleges and universities, and I've been for a long time advocate for increasing the presence of geospatial technology, geography, GIS, earth science, etc., at HBCUs, because it's just part of our mission. Tennessee State University's mission is think, work, serve. we're expected to do community service. If we're not doing community service, then we come into question. As opposed to some, I'm not going to say all, some majority institutions, if you start to do community-based work, then you're looked at as not being a true scientist, or maybe you're going outside of the academic mission. Why are you actually trying to help people? Why don't you just research them and not actually advocate them? I'm not some, not all. Obviously, there are places like the University of Michigan that clearly is on the forefront of community-based research and environmental justice research. And really, when we have minority serving institutions going into disenfranchised communities, then there's less of a trust barrier there. I've been involved in situations where there were communities that absolutely, positively did not want to work with academia whatsoever. But when they found out, oh, you're from a historically Black college and university, come on, sit down, let's break bread, let's get to work. The problem is we don't have enough presence of people like myself or Dr. Linda Luber at Morgan State University who can get into these communities and affect change. So that's my answer.
Great. And we're over a little bit on time, but Jennifer, you can provide a quick response yourself. That'd be great.
Sure. Since I've talked about the problems of binary thinking and the benefits of thinking relationally, I would just add to those comments that as geographers, we need to continue to dismantle the binary distinctions between social sciences, physical sciences, between what would count as positivist scientific knowledges and everything else. And we need to break the barrier between the community and the university. And I think that in the sake of time, let me just close by saying that perhaps we're at a particular moment as geographers in the face of COVID-19, in the face of the protests against white supremacy and institutional racism, to really claim our role as geographers to not only understand the world, but to transform it. And we can continue to push open those opportunities. I'm not as fortunate enough to be in an institution where community-based and service education is as integrated, but it's something that we're working toward. And I think this is a moment for us to harness, to make our contributions as geographers more meaningful and impactful.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer and David. So that's pretty much all the time we have for today. I just want to thank everybody for joining. I do quickly want to put in a plug for the next conversation in this series. So if you can join us on July 23rd at 12 p.m. Eastern, we'll have Dr. Elizabeth Root of The Ohio State University and Dr. Marie Price of George Washington University, who will be speakers for our next particular event. So with that, I'm going to call this to a close. Again, thanks again for joining. And as a reminder, both the recording and the slides will be made available in about a week's time through the committee's website. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.